Hey folks, welcome back for another build video. This time around we're doing something a little bit different. Instead of just showing you one build or maybe one build and a variation, we're going to try and tackle the entire concept of an all-red DPS or damage per second build. So while that is a bit of a tall task, I feel pretty comfortable doing it because I think there are really two main options to go with when you're going with an all-red DPS build. And then there are obviously an innumerable number of variations that you can go into based on your playstyle or personal preference. And we'll get into some of those, but I think there really are two main options, and those are the Providence 3-piece or the Strikers Battlegear combo. So the first one we're going to tackle here is the 3-piece Providence Defense combination. I think the shorthand there is 3-piece Prov or Prov 3-piece. All that means is you have 3 pieces of Providence Defense, 1 piece of Grupo Sombra S.r.o, Contractor's gloves, and Fox's Prayer Kneepads. The order you have those in isn't at all consequential. All you're really looking for are those 6 pieces in some order or combination and as much crit hit chance and crit hit damage as you can stack on one build. Before I get too far ahead of myself, I do want to get into some of the math behind a crit hit chance build. So first and foremost, in this game, you are capped at 60% crit hit chance. What that means is no matter how many attributes or mods that you stack on a build, the maximum amount of crit hit chance that you can have is 60%. And that includes weapon talents such as Finisher, Vindictive, and Adaptive Instincts. The only exception to that rule that I am aware of is Agonizing Bite, which is the talent on the Diamondback exotic rifle. And that is a special case that guarantees a critical hit for 5 seconds after hitting a mark. But other than that, that is something to keep in mind when you're stacking critical hit chance onto a build. Anything after 60% is going to be wasted because the game will not give you that percentage benefit. Now, I apologize to all of you who already knew that, but I just wanted to make that very clear for any newbies. Critical hit chance is capped at 60%. However, critical hit damage has no cap whatsoever, so you can stack as much critical hit damage as you want. However, at lower levels, there is a formula that you want to follow. I'll flash that up on screen, but just keep in the back of your head when you're making a build like this, where you're just stacking as much critical hit chance and critical hit damage as you can. You want to keep the number 55% in mind. If you can get to around 50-55% crit hit chance, that's a pretty good number to sit with. Obviously, if you can get it all the way to 60% without wasting any, that's the best case scenario. But oftentimes, if you do the calculation, when you're already in the mid to high 50s, you really are better off stacking it all into critical hit damage after that point to maximize your damage output. So with that out of the way, let's get into these two pure DPS builds. The first of which is obviously the 3-piece Providence Defense. And for the specialization, we've gone with Gunner, as it is one of the 2 pure specializations that I would recommend, the other being Sharpshooter for the weapon handling. But in this case, we've gone with Gunner for the Incessant talent, which grants 10% armor on kill, which is a great thing to have when you're running an all-red DPS build because you're not going to have a lot of armor to work with, so getting armor back on those kills is a great way to keep yourself upright. For our primary weapon, we've gone with the flavor of the day, and that is the St. Elmo's engine. And before I scroll down too far, I do want to point out that we have damage to target out of cover as the attribute here. And again, without getting into too much math, damage to target out of cover is the best way to maximize your damage. There are really 2 main options to go with here. It's either damage to target out of cover or damage to armor. But I think the best way I've heard it summarized as to which of those 2 choices to go with and why you should choose damage to target out of cover is because while you can choose whether your enemy is out of cover or not, you can't choose whether they're wearing armor. And to elaborate on that for just a moment, the other main reason to go with damage to target out of cover instead of damage to armor is that a lot of the heavier enemies won't have an armor bar, in which case all of that damage to armor is being wasted. And obviously, ideally, if you're trying to maximize all of the damage that you're doing, you want to optimize these stats. But the main reason why everyone is going with the St. Elmo's engine right now is not necessarily the Actum Est talent, because while it doesn't hurt to get shock rounds after 100 stacks, What you're really benefiting from here are all of those mods stacked down below. The 20% critical hit damage, 30 rounds, 20% weapon handling, and very crucially, the 20% critical hit chance on the muzzle here are what make this weapon absolutely a great choice to go with when you are going with a crit hit damage build, where you're trying to maximize the weapon damage that you're putting out on a per second basis. There are certainly other routes to go, but there's no other way to get that many benefits from your mods. And we'll get into them a little bit later, but I will go ahead and list off the Carbine 7 and the FAMAS 2010 as two other assault rifle variants that a lot of players will go with, especially before the s.r.o engine came out. And then one last point here, while you don't have to go with an assault rifle, it is a particularly powerful weapon to go with because of that health damage attribute there. Again, particularly on some of the tankier enemies that don't actually have an armor bar, all of the damage you will deal to them will be technically classed as damage to health. So having that extra attribute there of up to 21% health damage is a great way to take them down a lot faster. For our secondary weapon here, we've gone with the M1A CQB, which is another very common DPS weapon, particularly when you're looking at long-range targets. It is, however, the secondary weapon, as it doesn't really compete on a per second basis with a really good assault rifle like the s.r.o's engine, but it is a good thing to have and be able to switch to. Again, we've gone with damage to target out of cover as that secondary attribute down there. Obviously, if you're going to run this as your main build, you're going to want to get a higher damage to target out of cover there, but it'll do for the purposes of this guide. And then for the talent, we've gone with Boomerang. Critical hits have a 50% chance to return the bullet to the magazine. If a bullet is returned to the magazine, the next shot has a plus 40% increased damage. So as you can imagine, on a build that has the maximum critical hit chance here, having a 50% chance to then return that bullet to the magazine and have its damage amplified is a great way to boost your damage with your secondary weapon. And then for our sidearm here, we've gone with the Orbit. Your sidearm here truly is much more of a preferential pick, and given that this is a Dark Zone exclusive, not everyone will have one. So I will go ahead and mention that a D50 with the finisher talent would work here as well. But since we have it, we'll go ahead and show it off. The Orbit has the perfect finisher talent, where swapping from this weapon within 10 seconds of killing an enemy grants 35% critical hit chance and 40% critical hit damage for 15 seconds. Now, as I mentioned earlier, your critical hit chance is capped at 60%, so on this build in particular, pretty much all of that bonus is going to be wasted, but you do get an additional 40% critical hit damage for 15 seconds. So that's why we've gone ahead and included it here as an option, but I do want to restate the sidearm is absolutely a preferential pick. The majority of the time you're going to be using your assault rifle, particularly the s.r.o's engine if you have it. With that, let's get into our first piece of gear here, where we have the Grupo Sombra SA. That first brand bonus of plus 15% critical hit damage is why this one makes the cut. On top of that, we have a weapon damage core, critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and critical hit damage in the mod slot here. Obviously, your attributes may not be maxed out at first, but this is the goal. You want Grupo Sombra, 3 pieces of Providence Defense, Contractor's Gloves, and Fox's Prayer with all maxed out crit hit chance and crit hit damage. That will get you to the 60% crit hit chance cap, and then everything after that you can just plug into critical hit damage. But as you'll see later, not all of these pieces are perfect. And this is absolutely over a number of hours of gameplay. So don't get discouraged if you don't have max rolls for everything starting out. You can absolutely still use this build, even if it's not the maximized version. And while I'm sure someone might contradict me in the comments, I do want to note that even for raids, when you're running a DPS build, most groups will take you with anything at about 50% critical hit chance and 150% critical hit damage. So as long as you can get to about those levels, you should know that you're running an absolutely usable. So with that, we'll move into our backpack, where we have the Gift, which is the named Providence Defense backpack that lines up really well with the talent selection here, which is Vigilance, which increases total weapon damage by 25%, and taking damage disables this buff for 3 seconds. As I do want to note, and I try to make note of this on every build I include the Gift on, I am showing it here because I have it, and if you have one with critical hit damage and critical hit chance, you should run it as well. But it is a Dark Zone exclusive, so if you don't have it, don't worry. The normal version of Vigilance is nearly as good all it does is it increases that disabled time from 3 to 4 seconds. And if you're not frequenting the dark zone, it might be much easier to come across Providence Defense backpack with crit hit damage and crit hit chance that you can then roll Vigilance onto as a talent. Really, all you want to do here is come away with a Providence Defense backpack with weapon damage, critical hit chance, and critical hit damage in those secondary attribute slots. And then you can plug some more critical hit damage in that mod slot. And then before we leave this piece, I do want to talk about the brand bonus here. While 15% headshot damage isn't necessarily providing you a benefit all of the time, it will absolutely still buff your overall damage output as long as you're aiming for the head every so often. And really what it does is get you on your way to that 2 and 3 piece bonus of critical hit chance and critical hit damage. I'll talk about it a little bit more later, but those are particularly powerful, so I do recommend going this route, especially if you're running in a group where someone already has the Coyote's mask. For our chest, we have our second piece of Providence Defense and that all-important second brand bonus of plus 10% critical hit chance. As you can see, while it absolutely is not a perfect piece, it is still usable. It has a weapon damage core, critical hit chance, and critical hit damage in those secondary attribute slots. And then we plugged another critical hit damage mod in that mod slot. And then the reason why we didn't reroll any of those secondary attributes is because we wanted to be able to roll that talent to obliterate. Critical hits increase total weapon damage by 1% for 5 seconds, stacking up to 25 times. And again, given that we are rocking nearly 60% critical hit chance, those stacks will increase in no time, meaning that by very quickly into the meat of an encounter, you're going to have an additional 25% weapon damage provided by both your backpack and your chest piece. For gloves, we have Contractor's gloves here. One piece of Providence Defense isn't giving you anything as you're not going to be wielding an LMG on this build. But what you do get is that secondary brand bonus of damage to armor. As I talked about a little bit with the damage to target out of cover conversation, damage to armor isn't always going to provide a benefit as there are going to be enemies that don't have armor on them. But when they do, this is a great way to provide multiplicative damage to boost your overall weapon damage output. And then again here we have 12% critical hit damage rolled in that second secondary attribute slot. For our holster, we have our third piece of Providence Defense here, giving us that plus 15% critical hit damage bonus. And then additionally, we also have weapon damage, critical hit chance, and critical hit damage in those attribute slots. Now for our last, but certainly not least piece of gear here, we've gone with Fox's Prayer. First and foremost, Overlord Armament's one piece bonus of plus 10% rifle damage will be used when you use your secondary weapon here, but the primary reason for having this on our build is for that plus 8% damage to target out of cover attribute. As we stated up above with the St. Elmo's engine conversation, damage to target out of cover is just so powerful right now. I'll say it one more time. While you can't choose whether your enemy has armor, you can absolutely choose whether they're in cover or not. Whether between your skills, grenades, and your rushing ability, you can absolutely move a target out of cover to give yourself that additional bonus. And it's absolutely a tactic you should use so you can maintain your maximum amount of damage along with all of the critical hit damage that you've stacked on this build. Now last, we're going to get into our skills a little bit here. I want to start off by saying these are all preferential picks. On this build, you've got a tier 0 for your skills, so none of them are really going to be doing a ton of damage, but they all have incremental uses depending on what your particular playstyle depends on. For two standard options, we've gone with the Reviver Hive and the Riot Foam here. The Reviver Hive is a great option to go with for your personal use. If you do get downed, you can then use the Reviver Hive to get you back up, so you're not as dependent on your teammates to get you back up. And then the Riot Foam Chem Launcher is just a great way to stun lock your enemies. It applies Ensnare, which even at the lowest tier is absolutely usable when it's used at opportune times. With that, I want to go ahead and roll right into our second build here. For the sake of expediency, I don't want to go into any weapon changes quite yet. We're just going to compare and contrast the differences in gear. So whenever anyone asks what build they should put together to do the most amount of weapon damage, Striker's Battlegear is the first answer. And even when people are just asking what's a good overall DPS build to put together, Striker's Battlegear is absolutely an answer that makes its way to the top of the list. And to boil it down, that really is for three main reasons. Right off the top, it's a gear set, so if you're just starting out, this is much easier to put together than the Providence 3-piece brand that we just put together. because given that it is a gear set, you only have one secondary attribute to attend to. So as long as you get a good roll on your core attribute here, you are free to re-roll that secondary attribute to whatever you need it to be. On top of that, you can see the 2 and 3 piece bonuses of weapon handling and rate of fire are right up the alley of any weapon damage build. Particularly that 3-piece bonus of plus 15% rate of fire will help increase your DPS for obvious reasons. And then last but not least, you have that 4-piece bonus of a Striker's Gamble, which is the main reason people recommend this as a weapon damage DPS build. Weapon hits increase total weapon damage by 0.65%, stacking up to 100 times. So that's up to 65% additional weapon damage. And then 1 stack is lost per second between 0 and 50 stacks. And then 2 stacks are lost per second between 50 and 100 stacks. And before we go anywhere, I want to hop right over to the backpack talent here, as we can actually amend the reading of the Striker's Gamble talent, because the backpack here increases total weapon damage gained per stack from 0.6% to 1%, which is great for 2 reasons. One, of course, you're going to build your weapon damage a lot faster, but equally as importantly, you're now going to have an increased maximum from 65% to now 100% total weapon damage increased with the Striker's Gamble talent. So for obvious reasons, this is going to have a fantastic amount of weapon damage output on it once you build those stacks. And then one last thing to touch on, again, for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every secondary attribute on this build, but I did want to point out that on this build in particular, because we're working with a gear set that only has 1 secondary attribute, you're not able to stack as much critical hit chance between your brand bonuses and 2 secondary attributes. So I actually have the mass cure rolled to critical hit chance, and your particular mileage may vary here depending on what your watch level is at and depending on what particular weapon you are running. But I did want to make that note, because we're running with a gear set here, you're probably going to have to stack some critical hit chance on this build. And while you are sacrificing some critical hit damage, overall the Striker's Gamble stacks are going to more than make up for that. Speaking of which, I want to jump down to our chest piece here. Actually, we've gone with the Ceska Vyroba because it has that 1-piece brand bonus of plus 10% critical hit chance, which for all of the reasons we just listed above when we were talking about the Striker's Battlegear set, is particularly necessary here to get us to that 60% critical hit chance cap. And then once again, you can see down there we're rocking weapon damage, critical hit chance, critical hit damage, and critical hit damage in the mod slot. But again, based on your particular place in the game, particularly where your watch is currently leveled up to, you may need to roll more of these to critical hit chance, or more realistically, what I would recommend doing is if you're having trouble getting to that 55%, 60% critical hit chance cap, is actually to swap your mods in for critical hit chance, and then later, as your watch level grows, you can then swap those back in for critical hit damage once you have this build all the way up to its maximum potential. I'm going to go ahead and breeze through these here, but as you can see for our gloves and our holster, we have the last 2 pieces of Striker's Battlegear, both of which are rocking weapon damage and critical hit damage. And then for our knee pads, we have the same Fox's Prayer with weapon damage, damage to target out of cover, and critical hit damage. And then just to talk about it one more time, obviously on this build, given that you need 4 pieces of Striker's Battlegear, and we've gone with the Ceska Vyroba chest piece for the reasons we've already talked about, what that leaves you with is an option to either go with Contractor's gloves or Fox's Prayer in that 6th slot. And again, the main reason for going with Fox's Prayer here is the conversation about damage to target out of cover versus damage to armor, where again, if you can only have one, the best choice to go with is damage to target out of cover. For our talent here, we've also gone with Obliterate once again. There are a couple different options you could go with that we'll get into later for red DPS builds, but this is the most common choice I see and the one I would recommend, particularly with Striker's Battlegear. It just pairs so well between stacking Obliterate and Striker's Battlegear on your weapon hits. It's just a fantastic amount of weapon damage. It really seems to work well when you run both of these, knowing that in an encounter early on, you're going to need to build your stacks, but then once you do, you're just going to be putting out an awesome amount of firepower. And then as a final note, I did want to bring up the Striker's Battlegear chest piece, which sports the Press the Advantage talent, increasing your max stacks for Striker's Gamble from 100 to 200, and then 3 stacks are lost per second between 100 and 200 stacks. Now, while at first this seems really great because it increases your max stacks from 100 to 200, thereby increasing your total weapon damage increase from 100 to 200%, the reason not to go with this is because unless you're running on really high level content with really tanky enemies, honestly, I'm really just talking about legendary content here is kind of the only place where you can keep these stacks reliably at 200, meaning that more often than not, if you're not running on legendary, you're really not going to be able to keep these stacks up to the point where it's beneficial to run this chess piece over Ceska Vyroba with Obliterate. Now again, your preference may vary, or you may exclusively run legendary content, in which case the chess piece is absolutely something you can consider. But for most cases, I would recommend Ceska Vyroba and Obliterate over the Striker's Battlegear chess piece. So with that, I want to do a little bit of a soft wrap up here. Those are the 2 main DPS builds to go with. If you're first starting out, those are the ones you are most commonly going to be recommended. So there they are. Absolutely did not come up with these, but they are absolutely something that you should give a try, especially if you're looking for something to maximize your weapon damage. If I was going to recommend which one to do first, I would go with Striker's Battlegear, primarily because it is easier to put together. But if you get a taste for that all red core DPS life, you should absolutely take a look at the Providence Defense 3-piece build. It is a great way to stack crit hit damage and crit hit chance and just have a really high floor of weapon damage output. But either one are absolutely great ways to go if you're looking to go with DPS. Now with that, let's get into some variations here. If you like in the DPS life, but you want a little bit of variety, maybe you want a little bit extra armor, maybe you want your skills to be a little bit more effective, these upcoming builds that we're going to try and breeze through may be the choice for you. So starting off, you can see that we've swapped our specialization from either gunner or sharpshooter to the technician. And while that +1 skill tier is nice, it's really only for one main reason, which is for the linked laser pointer that gets unlocked with this specialization. The technician laser pointer pulses enemies when they are aimed at, and it is an underbarrel attachment for long rails. Now that is crucial to keep in mind because not all weapons are going to be able to take the linked laser pointer, but very importantly, the Carbine 7 is, which means we can run the Carbine 7 with the linked laser pointer. And then down here we have the Flatline Talent, which amplifies weapon damage by 15% to pulsed enemies, and it also applies pulse after 3 kills to the next enemy that you hit. But that's not going to be a problem because with the linked laser pointer, any enemy that we are aiming at and therefore firing at, you're already going to pulse them, giving you that automatic plus 15% damage to pulsed enemies. And if you're reading ahead, that goes really well with the chest talent of Spotter, which does the exact same thing but also includes plus 15% skill damage. For a secondary weapon, I just wanted to take a moment to run through some different options. Obviously, on any build like this, your primary weapon is going to be the main weapon that you're running. Let's call it 80 to 90% of the time. So what that really means is you should be using your secondary weapon as a way to switch up your playstyle for one reason or another, whether it be a rifle with boomerang for the times you need to sit back and take pot shots at your enemy, or in this case with this option we've gone with the mop, which gives you an additional plus 10% armor on kill, which if you pair it with the gunner specialization will mean you're actually getting 20% armor on kill. But for this build it would only be 10%, but I do want to point that out as an option in case you don't like to use rifles or you just find it's not for you and you want to look for other options. On top of that, now that we're not using the St. Elmo's engine, you could reserve your exotic weapon choice for your secondary weapon, and if you are doing that, the Scorpio is a fantastic shotgun to go with. The Septic Shock talent is a great way to stun lock your enemy, 1 shot to poison, 3 shots to disorient, 6 to shock, and then after that, targets take additional 20% damage from all sources. So particularly if you're running in a group, this is a great weapon to use. You can go up, stun lock your enemy, and then increase the damage taken when all of your teammates are firing on the enemy. And then last but not least, I did want to highlight the ACS-12 shotgun here, as it is another great choice to go with. It is a rapid firing shotgun, meaning that it's going to take full advantage of the crit hit chance that you have stacked on your build. And while we also have Flatline on this shotgun, you could go with a couple of different options if you wanted to. Optimist is a great one, along with Unhinged if you're good at compensating for that lack of weapon handling. With that out of the way, let's get into our mask. We've gone with Coyote's mask here, which is seemingly built for a crit hit DPS build. We have those attributes of crit hit chance and crit hit damage, but we also have the Pack Instincts talent, where you and your allies gain a bonus based on the distance of the last enemy that you hit. So crucially, at a 0 to 15 meter range, you get a plus 25% critical hit damage increase, which, given that you already have your maximum amount of crit hit chance on this build, means that you're just stacking more crit hit damage. If you do attack from medium or long range, you can see there's a sliding scale of how much crit hit damage or crit hit chance that it gives you. And another nice thing about this talent is, crucially, if you're running a rifle as your secondary weapon and you engage your targets from 25 meters or more, you're going to get an increase of 25% crit hit chance, meaning that even when you switch to your secondary weapon that may not have the same amount of critical hit chance stacked on it, you can maintain your maximum stack of 60% crit hit chance. As you can see down there, we haven't gone with any pieces of Providence Defense on this particular build, so we're leaning into trying to replicate those 2 and 3 piece bonuses with 1 piece of Ceska Vyroba on the backpack and 1 piece of Grupo Sombra on the chest piece. For the Ceska Vyroba backpack, we've also rolled Vigilance as our talent here. Just like before, it increases total weapon damage by 25%, and taking damage disables this debuff for 4 seconds. If you're not a big fan of Vigilance, one other backpack talent I do want to mention is Unstoppable Force, where killing an enemy increases your total weapon damage by 5% for 15 seconds, and that stacks up to 5 times. So if you are getting kills constantly, you can get up to the same plus 25% weapon damage bonus. But generally, I do recommend Vigilance. It is a great way to start off with a higher weapon damage. And as long as you're taking down your targets fast enough, they won't have time to damage you, disabling the buff. For our chest piece, we have our 1 piece of Grupo Sombra SA to give us that plus 15% critical hit damage. And then as you can see, these are not maxed rolls, but they do have weapon damage, critical hit damage, and critical hit chance in our secondary attribute slots. And then we've gone with critical hit damage in our mod slot. And then as we talked about with the linked laser pointer and our Carbine 7 with Flatline, we have paired with that the Spotter chest talent, which amplifies total weapon and skill damage by 15% to pulsed enemies. So between Flatline and Spotter, we're getting an additional 30% to pulsed enemies. And thanks to our linked laser pointer, every enemy we aim at is going to be pulsed with our Carbine 7. So while the damage cap is lower here than it would be with, say, Optimist and Obliterate, one of the reasons that people choose to run this instead is because it provides a higher floor to start an encounter with, even if it may not have the same ceiling at the end. With that, we've gone back to the Contractor's gloves for this build for the same reason that they were on the 3-piece Providence Defense build. Damage to armor is just a fantastic multiplicative attribute. And then here for our holster, we have our main reason for swapping this all around. If you want a little bit more armor on your build here, but you want to maintain those 6 weapon damage cores, Picaro's holster is obviously the way to go. That core attribute of armor, secondary attribute of weapon damage, and then we've rolled the last attribute there to critical hit damage. And then last but not least, we have our constant throughout all of these builds, our Fox's Prayer, with those plus 8% damage to target out of cover. And with that, we'll go ahead and get into our skills here. You could obviously go with the Reviver Hive, as you are going to be up close and personal on a build that doesn't stack a ton of armor, so you are going to still be somewhat fragile, which means that having the Reviver Hive might be a nice way to pick yourself up if your teammates aren't available. But since you do have the Technician specialization on, you could also go with the Artificer Hive here, which will help periodically heal your Crusader Ballistic Shield, which is our choice of secondary skill here, given that we have 2 shield tiers between the one from our Technician specialization and the one from Picaro's holster. While you can certainly still run a Crusader Ballistic Shield on the purer versions of the DPS builds that we just showed, having a tier 2 shield will increase the amount of health and survivability that that shield provides. And then in that vein, we're going to go ahead and do one more variation. I can't help myself. If you're leaning into this off-meta DPS build and want even more survivability or just even more skill tiers to play around with, you could absolutely swap out the Contractor's gloves for a 2nd piece of Brazos de Arcabuz, keeping in mind that the 1st piece is provided by the Picaro's holster that we already had. If you get attributes of critical hit damage and critical hit chance, this would be a way to maintain your 6 weapon damage cores, as you can then re-roll the native armor core that comes with Brazos de Arcabuz to a weapon damage core. And then for that second brand bonus there, you're going to get an additional skill tier, which is going to buff your shield health even more with now a tier 3 shield as opposed to the tier 2 that we just showed. And then I want to provide one additional note about the Coyote's mask here. While on the previous build, we had Grupo Sombra, which gives you plus 15% critical hit damage as the first brand bonus. Obviously, as you can read down there, Pack Instinct will give you a higher critical hit damage bonus when you're engaging targets from 0 to 15 meters, which is a very common thing to do with an all-red DPS build. One of the reasons why I wanted to show the 3-piece Providence Defense first is because if any other of your group mates are already running Coyote's mask, there's no reason to be running it twice because it doesn't stack as far as I am aware. If they've made a change to the game or if someone has definitive proof, please provide it in the comments and I will absolutely provide it as a note to this video's description. But as of recording, and to my knowledge, if multiple people in a group are running Coyote's masks, you don't get the Pack Instincts benefit twice, which is why the Providence Defense 3-piece or the Striker's Battlegear combo are common options to go with, and particularly commonly asked for in raids, because quite often someone in your group is already going to be running Coyote's mask, meaning that there's no benefit to running it twice. But if you are running solo, I did want to make that note because Coyote's mask will give you a higher critical hit damage bonus when you're engaging targets from 0 to 15 meters, which is absolutely the sweet spot for this build. But with that out of the way, let's swap back to our Providence 3-piece one last time. We'll show it off in all its glory. Threw a lot of information there at you, but hopefully some of it stuck. If not, feel free to go back, try and make sense of all of my rants and ramblings. But the purpose of this video was to just put some very common all red core DPS weapon builds in front of you so you can mix and match, learn, put them together, see if it benefits your playstyle, and of course, spark some conversation about what everyone's opinions are. If you already run builds like this and you have a particular variation that you didn't see here that you think would work really well, feel free to throw it in the comments below. If we get enough of them, we would love to do another video like this, where we can put variations of similar builds in front of you to digest and enjoy. As always, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more, and please tell your friends about the channel if you think they'd like it, because it continues to help us grow and make weird videos like this. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
That nobody knows. Have a drink.
Progress resumed. Detecting additional hostile contacts. Incoming hostiles detected. Good. detected. Serious trauma detected. Hostiles guarding location nearby. Agent down.
We weathered the storm.